Today I want to talk to you guys about the book of Jane Eyre, and instead of me just sitting there and talking to you about it while holding the book, I thought it would be cool to take a look at a project that I did in undergrad, which is this website known as the History of Jane Eyre. I made this website as the finale of my Research of Literature class, where our goal was to take a very deep dive into a book and create something based off of all of the information we have researched. For me, I decided to do a website, so let's take a look at what this website has to offer. I will also be linking the website in the description, so if you want to take a more deep dive look at it, feel free to. It is public. So we come to this Welcome to Jane Eyre, where I explain the purpose of this website, which is for me just to give as much information as I can. I technically broke the rules of the project by refusing to have an endpoint, but I also did a lot more research and, as you can see, sections and deep dives than most of my other classmates did, so my professor thought that that leveled out enough that I didn't actually have to have a endpoint, and I could keep my website kind of as factual as possible without really having much like discussion or debate. Of course, you have the classic how to navigate the website. You just click buttons pretty much. And then I have this deep dive of what new historism is. I think this is kind of important to talk about now because for people who haven't seen the few videos I do have on this channel, you probably wouldn't know that I fall under the new historism view of literature, which just simply means that I like to focus more on the historical background of literature when I talk about it, instead of just talking about my own emotions or feelings about a book. I believe that history has a huge thing to say in how we read or look at a story, and for that reason I always keep it in the forefront of discussing it. And so this little section here is a big background on what new historism is, and also how it applies to the book Jane Eyre. We then, of course, have a little background on what the Victorian era is, because that was the era in which Jane Eyre was written. I also have a brief summary of Jane Eyre, so if you've never read it before, there's 3 paragraphs that summarize the entire story pretty much. And I've also got a list of characters, so every person is mentioned here, as well as what role, a simple little sentence about what role they played in the book. We then go on to the different sections, which the part I'm kind of most excited to talk about to you guys with. So the first is the publishing of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre's whole publishing journey is absolutely fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating publishing stories of a book you'll ever hear about. And it's because of so many different factors. The first one probably, and the biggest probably, being the fact that Charlotte published under a pen name of Eyre Bell. Not only that, but her sisters, both of her sisters, also wrote stories, and they too published under a pen name with the last name of Bell. And this led to so much trouble with getting the book published, in the fact that no one could get the rights to Jane Eyre because they couldn't really decide who actually wrote the story out of the 3 sisters. And therefore just no one secured the rights, and that meant that this book could be sold for 25 cents when the average novel sold at $1.25. That meant that this book became accessible to a ton of people who didn't have access to stories like this normally. But that wasn't the only reason that this exploded. There was also this mystery behind the author of Jane Eyre in 2 ways. Because of the pen name, people, and it being gender neutral, people were trying to guess if the author was a man or a woman, and there was a lot of debate about it. A lot of people even believed that it was a brother-sister team. It was just crazy, and this of course brought a lot of publicity to the book and caused even more people to read it. And then after Charlotte came out as being the author of the story, it just got even more crazy, as now people were trying to decide if Jane Eyre was an autobiography or not, because the life of Jane Eyre and the life of Charlotte have so many similarities, with both of them going to board school and both of them having worked as governesses, and so people would read the story trying to get insight into the author herself to see if they were related. And then after Charlotte's death, one of her friends published a book called The Life of Charlotte Bronte, and that just brought even more interest into Jane Eyre as people read this book and compared it to Jane Eyre to see if they could find similarities. It was just a whole thing. There was such an intrigue about the author that brought more people to read this story and be interested in it. And because of all that, it was received by a lot of people very positively in the fact that comparing another book to Jane Eyre was considered, and kind of still is considered, one of the highest praises a writer could receive. There was also a lot of debate on the morals of the story, if they were good for you to read or not, which only made people want to read it more. So overall, there was just so much mystery and intrigue built around the story when it was first published that it became an instant success, which is not something many women writers get to see. So it's really cool to see how that happened for Jane Eyre. The next section I have was a whole thing about education, so talking about the child in the Victorian era and how they aren't actually they are seen really weirdly, as in that they're seen as little people, as little adults, but at the same time they're seen as not having the intelligence or emotional capability to speak for themselves or understand their emotions, and for those two reasons they were supposed to stay quiet, stay out of the way, and just eventually work as soon as they can and just enter the adult world as quickly as possible. Mind you, this era, the Victorian era, is an era of change, and one of those things that was changing was this idea of childhood, and the idea of actually creating a childhood for children to be educated and all that stuff in. The thing about Jane Eyre, though, is that it goes against the classic style of Victorian era, with Jane as a child being very capable of expressing complex emotions and responding to situations and having an extremely strong idea of justice. In other words, Jane Eyre was coming out in a time in which the idea of childhood was changing, and it brought with it a new idea of what a child could be through the eyes of this child of Jane. And it's just so interesting to compare Jane as a child in this book to the idea of what a child is during the Victorian era in which this book was written. You can't talk about Jane Eyre without talking about gender for obvious reasons. This book is seen as somehow one of the most pro-feminine and most anti-feminine book out there. So the fact I can hold both titles at the same time has always impressed me. So, of course, I've got a little section about gender where I talk about the classic Victorian woman with Queen Victoria, and then also a little section about women's place in religion, in the sense that religion kind of became a place where women could find their own freedom, and in Jane Eyre itself, that was another place in which Jane found her own freedom when her cousin, I want to say, it's been a while since I've read the book, when her cousin St. John tells her that it's God's calling for her to marry him, she gets to say, actually, I know what God wants for me. We have all agreed in the Protestant world that a woman is able to have a direct connection to God just as a man is, and I don't believe God wants me to marry you. If you want me to come as a missionary with you to India, sure, but not as husband and wife. And instead she hears a voice calling her away from St. John to find her way back to Mr. Rochester. Another thing that's really fascinating about the woman's role that Jane Eyre did was that Jane Eyre opens the door for women authors to write stories and still be seen as respectable. The reason that Charlotte Burnett and her sisters write under a pen name is because it is seen as scandalous for a woman to be writing a story, especially a story like Jane Eyre. And the main reason for this is that women writers were often seen as part of the lower class, as someone who had to make money somehow, and therefore they kind of just sell their soul and their ideas to the world through stories. But because of the success of Jane Eyre and the way they weaved the mystery behind the story and the author and the way she revealed herself, she was able to retain her image as a respectable middle-class woman, and because of that, she opened the door for a lot of other authors to do the exact same thing. So it's kind of amazing to see how her character in the book pushes gender boundaries, while the author herself was also doing so. Religion was like another huge theme of Jane Eyre. I did this section kind of interestingly. I think I would do it differently if I did it now, but I started out by listing the 3 main examples of religion inside the book, such as the Mr. Brocklehurst, I probably butchered that, but I really don't care, he was a horrible person, who saw himself as a like religious figure in these girls' lives, you know, saying a child's going to go to hell if you misbehave, and that the girl's hair should be cut short because it makes them vain, while meanwhile his wife and daughter are dressed in the best that Victorian has to offer, and it's just so funny. But then you have Helen, who is this person who will turn the other cheek, who's showing love even if someone refuses to love her back, and like her impact on Jane's life. And then of course you have St. John, who is so determined to become a missionary that he denies his love of Rosamond Oliver, who would never fit in that missionary life, and instead asks Jane to marry him, even though and then even after she turns him down, he ends up going out and becoming a missionary anyways. And something so fascinating about the book that has tons of people still talking and thinking and debating about it is that it's not Jane who has the final word in the novel, it's St. John, with the final little bit of the novel being about you learning that St. John did become a missionary, but that it cost him his life. I then actually deep dive into the history of Christianity and the whole idea of the Protestants movement being growing, and as well as really interesting is that how Charlotte Burnett is actually exposed to a ton of these like more Protestant preachers just because her father was an Irish Anglican priest, and because of that position Charlotte got exposed to all of these really cool figures and their ideas about religion, and she got to hear by all these people who were like influential figures in development of the Protestant church. But something else that was so interesting is that there's letters from Charlotte to her friends where she's struggling with the idea of her faith, and she dislikes Catholicism, but she's also really, really fascinated by the idea of symbols of your faith and being allowed to have that, and that actually bleeds into Jane Eyre, which is super cool. Yeah, and then I also had like some key terms down here for some of the words and language that I was using in this particular page. The last page that actually is a deep dive is about class. This one is probably like the least connected to the story itself. I talk about slavery in Victorian England, and I think that was mostly because I felt like I was required to for the class. Slavery isn't the biggest topic in Jane Eyre. There's a little bit in there, but it's not like major. It's definitely not enough to have like this huge section about slavery in Victorian England, but because of the way my class was set up, I felt like I was required to talk about slavery in my website somewhere, so I had this whole thing up here. I also give like a little brief paragraph. There's not much about how like Charlotte Burnett's interaction with slavery and the magazine she actually read about it, which was kind of interesting. But getting past like the whole slavery section, we actually get to what the book actually has to say about class, which is Jane's movement through it. And one of the most fascinating things I learned by researching the history of like Victorian England is its adoption practices, or kind of lack of. It's fascinating, but during Victorian England, when a child was adopted by a family, it was often informal, and this person who gets adopted very rarely, if ever, receives the status of those who adopted it. Meaning that Jane, who was a middle-class child, or low-class, I don't remember which, when her parents died, got adopted by a high-class family, but she was still viewed and treated as a member of the middle class. And that was a normal occurrence. This is something that was actually happening during Victorian England, is that you would have these children being adopted for like pity reasons, or because they were part of like a distant relation or something like that, but that these children would still be stuck in the same class from which they were adopted from, even though the person adopting them was higher, which I think is a dumb way to view adoption, and I'm glad we don't do that anymore, and that's all I'm going to say on that. Jane then also becomes a governess, which means she's becoming an official member of the middle class, but she could also escape that. She is given a chance to escape that middle class when Mr. Rochester proposes to her, which I found out isn't like the craziest thing in the world. If a guy wanted to marry someone from a lower class, they pretty much could. It was kind of given like the side eye, but at the same time they weren't stopped, and they were allowed to do that. What would have been like very controversial and made people very upset was if a woman of the high class wanted to marry a guy of a lower class. That was seen as like just not able to happen and almost never ever did. Of course, when Jane finds out Mr. Rochester is still married, that means she would be turned into his mistress, which is definitely seen as a lower than middle class, and so she's not having any of that and flees, and then she finds herself inheriting a vast fortune, which puts her in the same level, and that's just something that would have never really happened. It was extremely rare. I think I found like one example of it happening, and it was to a man, so it wasn't even to a woman like Jane is. Most of the fortune goes to families in the same social class as the member who died, even if that person isn't as close as a relation. So if you have like a cousin who's considered middle class, but a second cousin who's seen as like higher class, the money will more likely go to that second cousin just because they're in the same class, even though the cousin is a closer relationship. Really weird. I don't understand Victorian England very much, but it was fascinating to learn about all that stuff for this type of project. And then, of course, I had the works cited, which just shows all of the different like articles and stuff that I used during my study of Jane Eyre and my deep dive into the history behind it. And I hope you guys found this interesting. Again, feel free to click the link in the description and take a closer look at this website for yourself. But this is all I've got time for tonight. I hope you guys have a lovely night, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye!